Sometimes economists need to push the boundaries of convention to find the answers they're looking for.
It matters because I think before that, there was a common perception that any work that includes lynching, for example, was going to be rejected out of hand. I'm Lisa D. Cook. I am professor of economics at Michigan State University. I was asking, I thought, a fairly fundamental question related to macroeconomics, and that was the effect of violence on economic growth.
Welcome to this podcast produced by the International Monetary Fund. Today's episode is the first in a series that will showcase extraordinary work by extraordinary women in economics, like Dr. Lisa Cook, who in one of her many unconventional studies used data on lynching and racial violence in the U.S. to shine some light on Russia's innovation slump.
I just found that in Russia in the 1990s or America in the 1890s, violence was just such an impediment to economies achieving their potential.
Rhoda Metcalfe sat down with Lisa D. Cook to talk about her work and the hurdles she came up against along the way.
Other economists have called your work groundbreaking, especially your research looking at the economic cost of racism and sexism. Mm-hmm. One of your research papers looked at the relationship between race riots and lynchings in America and patents. Now, a lot of people, a lot of economists, would not see the connection between these two things, race riots and patents. Can you explain why you put those two things together and what it revealed?
I can explain that, and if I will beg your indulgence because it's sort of a winding story. So when I was writing my dissertation in Russia, I was talking to both bankers and to managers and entrepreneurs, and I was asking them about the banking system, and we had these long interviews, and for the most part, at the end of the interview, they would ask me questions. What are you understanding about our banking system? And oh, by the way, why can't we get innovation going in Russia? We have a history of invention and we have inventors. So why can't we get innovation going? And I thought to myself, look around, like very random violence was becoming quite normal. Right. So I was thinking, it is difficult for anybody to work here who needs silence and certainty. So I went back to Berkeley, finished my dissertation, but this question bugged me. Like, why was it they had such a high endowment of human capital and they still couldn't get innovation going? So I thought, well, maybe there's an historical experiment. Is there a place, is there a time when you had the conditions for intellectual property rights to be protected, but something else about the environment changed? And I thought, well, maybe we can look back to the late 19th century, early 20th century in the United States, and maybe we can look at something like patents, because I knew about patents that in the patent records, you had dates, and those dates could be matched to events related to physical terror. So racial massacres, lynchings, and the passage of segregation laws. I thought, well, maybe this could help us inform what went on in Russia.
So you had this idea that the drop in innovation that seemed to be happening in Russia might be connected to the rise in violence. and that something similar might have happened in the U.S. when violence began to rise against the African American community at the turn of the century.
Right. And it was something that, again, I had in the back of my head. So that's why I wanted it to be historical. But I also wanted to make sure that there was some control group, right? So we had some inventors who were affected and some who were not. So what I saw, putting the lynching data, especially with the patent data, what I saw was really striking. And the first thing that I noticed was that Black inventors and white inventors were doing completely different things starting in 1900. So while the two lines related to invention were moving in the same direction before 1900, they were going completely opposite directions after 1900. Like, what happened in 1900 that would be so devastating, so different for the two populations that one would stop inventing almost altogether? Because for the data that I had through 1940, this is a permanent shock. And it has had a lasting effect until this day, because it's still, according to my calculations, 1899 is still for per capita invention, 1899 is still the peak for African Americans.
So up until 1899, both white and Black inventors the invention patents were on the rise generally for both populations.
Yes, exactly. Yes, right. Although the patents per capita were quite different. They were moving in the same direction. And that's what I would have expected for inventors. But the second graph showed what was happening with respect to lynchings and patents. And you saw the patent activity go up when lynchings were low, and you saw it go down when lynchings were high.
Right. So then you're saying you went to some of these great economic minds with your statistics and you said, what am I seeing here?
That's right. That's right. And I was lucky enough to be able to talk to, Nobel laureates fairly regularly. And I talked to a lot of my former professors at Berkeley, new professors at Stanford over a 3-year period. Milton Friedman was the most stark. He said that this is one of the most original ideas that he's seen in a generation. And he said, you've got to publish this. Absolutely do. And with Paul Romer, of course, the idea was, anything that happens to innovation is going to happen to the economy. It's going to happen to economic growth. It's going to impede the arrival of ideas.
So what did you pull out of that? I mean, you had this concept. A piece of it, obviously, was this idea that the impact on innovation of these dramatic shocks of violence and lack of, the rule of law.
Right.
But taking it to the next step beyond the idea of how much does it affect the community itself, but also the wider economy. Were you able to quantify that?
What I was trying to quantify was the effect that diminishing the number of patents would have if I scaled it to the United States. And what I found was that this would equate to the number of patents that a medium-sized European country would have produced during that period, which would have been huge. So that's how I calibrated it. But I was inferring what would happen to the U.S. economy if white inventors were subjected to this. So I actually calculated this. And what I found was that business investment would have been much depressed and innovation would have been a lot lower because it was so volatile. It would have been much more volatile. And that's a situation in which you wouldn't see as much investment.
Wow, really interesting. So, I mean, you're also known for your work looking at financial institutions and development. Mm-hmm. Is there an overarching theme to the kind of research you like to focus on?
There is, and I think it relates to property rights. I've looked at property rights through the prism of economic activity, through patents, through the banking system, and the necessity of having the rule of law in place to get the outcomes that we expect from mature, growing economies, and economies that help societies to meet the social compact that they've made with their leaders. That is, that every generation does better than the preceding generation.
And why is this of such interest to you? Why are you so drawn to this focus?
I just found that in, Russia in the 1990s or America in the 1890s, violence was just such an impediment to people living their lives, economies achieving their potential.
I understand that your family background, your upbringing, has been an important impetus for your work, especially looking at the impact that racism has had on economics. So what was going on around you as you were growing up that made you think about these questions?
I was growing up in the desegregating South in a college town in the middle of Georgia. It was quite a rural place, but a college town nonetheless. And this was a period it was called freedom of choice period. So white parents could choose to go to a school, or they started their own, what they're now called is white flight schools. And that's what a lot of white parents did. But some of them remained in the school and they weren't accustomed, I guess, to seeing Black children. So I was definitely beaten up. I still have a scar where I was hit in my eyebrow. So I'm constantly reminded of being beaten at school during this period of segregation. And the reason I know that it was a racist incident was because the child called me the N-word, and I'd never heard it before, and went home to ask what that meant. I mean, my skating rink was integrated in 1980 because it had been all white before. We got a pool, a community pool at about the same time, because as happened in many small towns across the country, the pool was filled with cement rather than allowing African Americans to swim in the same pool.
And your parents were, from my understanding, they were pushing the boundaries of African American professional jobs too. Both of them, weren't they?
Yes, they absolutely were. My mom was on the faculty of nursing in the School of Nursing, and became tenured there. And so she's the first one hired. And this was at Georgia College State University, it's called now. So it was a small liberal arts college. But she definitely broke the glass ceiling with respect to Black faculty members. And my dad was the first Black person to be hired by this large psychiatric hospital, one of the largest in the Southeast, Central State Hospital.
As a chaplain, right?
As a chaplain, exactly. And his role was that of a peacemaker in the community more broadly. He was working with civil rights groups, with religious groups to bring about desegregation, to support voting rights throughout his lifetime.
And you stepped into sort of a similar role when you were in college, right? You were sort of right in the mix as well, weren't you, in terms of protest, in terms of pushing issues?
Right. This is a very heady political time. South Africa was on the cusp of becoming a multiracial democracy. And all colleges around the country were protesting our investment in South Africa. We led a protest that wound up being in the New York Times. We locked up the Board of Trustees to engage in divestment. So yes, but I also protested some fairly benign things because it was what you do when you show up on a college campus. And I was also the freshman class president. I was working within the system and using any tactic that I thought would work.
Right. But you didn't, although you were doing extremely well academically, you didn't go straight into economics.
That's right.
In fact, it's interesting that the finance and development article about you is entitled "The Accidental Economist."
Right.
So what kind of work were you planning to do, and how did you veer into economics?
I showed up at Spelman majoring in physics and philosophy. There were 5 generations, by that time, 4 generations of Baptist ministers in my family. I thought the signal that I need to send is that I'm not doing that. And so what better majors to choose than physics and philosophy, right? But it turned out to be the questions that I was interested in. So, at Oxford, I read PPE, philosophy, politics, and economics. But then I went to live in Senegal. I studied at the University of Dakar, and I was going to be there studying the concept of time in African philosophy. And in the meantime, there were some crazy things going on for a person who'd never lived in Africa before. I was paying $10 for a Bic pen that would typically cost me 10 cents in the US. I just saw distorted prices everywhere. And I just started asking myself, how on earth could they afford to be students here? This is my exposure to economic policy, monetary policy that really affected people's lives. And I had this ticket to travel in the rest of Africa, wound up climbing Kilimanjaro with a Cambridge-trained economist. And he was the one to advocate, because I really had this deeply philosophical crisis. Should I do this PhD in philosophy, as I was thinking? Should I go back to physics? What should I be doing at this point? And this person who was hiking with me for 5 hours said that I should be doing economics, and he was completely convinced of this. His view was that the kinds of questions I was interested in answering, would require the tools of economics.
And what questions were you asking?
Why some countries develop faster than others. And I was approaching that as a philosophical question before, because I was studying philosophy. But it fundamentally was not, as he and I started talking about it. It was an empirical question. So, yeah, I took his advice. I checked it with my tutors at Oxford and wound up in the program at Berkeley.
So then later, with your research paper on lynchings and patents, despite all the great feedback you'd gotten from these Nobel laureates, you had a really hard time getting it published, right?
It was really discouraging to keep sending out this paper and just getting rejected left and right, and having to write, again, these very extensive referee reports that contained information that I thought was fairly fundamental to an American education. And, in fact, I was told in probably 2003 that if I used the lynching data, I would never get the paper published, that economists did not like seeing lynching data whatsoever, that this was taboo to use. A lot of this was very new in the sense that they hadn't seen national lynching data, for example. They hadn't seen data on inventions from African Americans. They hadn't seen data on segregation laws. So one thing that George Akerlof actually warned me about, I talked to him at the end of my time at Stanford, and he said that in his Lemons paper, it wasn't readily accepted because he introduced something very new, and people were reluctant, economists were reluctant to embrace it. And he said, you've got a lot that's new going on here. So, manage your expectations.
At some point, things began to shift for you such that now your work is lauded as innovative and groundbreaking. How did that shift happen? And what does it matter that work like yours is taken seriously in the world of economics?
It matters because I think before that, there was a common perception that any work that includes lynching, for example, was going to be rejected out of hand. That I was asking, I thought, a fairly fundamental question related to macroeconomics, and that was the effect of violence on economic growth. So the paper being accepted and then the paper being discussed more broadly has been a real opening and shown a real openness that had not been shown before. I mean, again, the person who said, you will not get this published, was saying that I wouldn't get anything related to lynching published. And now we're using lynching for so many different things in economics to understand the past and to understand the present. So I think this is just a really great special moment, and I'm grateful that the work has been embraced. And I hope that has provided some inspiration to Black economists, to women economists who have come behind me. I was also told that if I studied women and innovation, that I would never get tenure. So here I am, not only studying innovation, but the work has been picked up by the U.S. Congress, and legislation has been based on that research. So I think, again, this is it's been an inflection point in the economics profession, and I'm glad to have been on both sides of it.
Dr. Lisa Cook, your work is very thought-provoking, and I really appreciate you taking the time to sit down and speak with me about it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
That was Rhoda Metcalfe speaking with Dr. Lisa Cook, Professor of Economics and International Relations at Michigan State University. And as Dr. Cook pointed out, her work is indeed influencing U.S. lawmakers. The Inventor Diversity for Economic Advancement Act, or the IDEA Act, is a proposed bipartisan act of Congress that aims to address disparities in the number of women and diverse ethnic groups who participate in the patent process or the process of innovation. Go to lisadcook.net to find her research papers, including the one discussed today using lynching data. You can also read a wonderful profile on Dr. Cook in the December 2020 edition of Finance and Development magazine. Check it out at imf.org/F&D. And look for other IMF podcasts wherever you get your podcasts. You can also follow us on Twitter at IMF_podcast. I'm Bruce Edwards.
And I'm Rhoda Metcalfe. Thanks for listening.